Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another in our live stream series to help answer questions about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in our mountain towns and communities. My name is Kelly Geary Agnew, and I'm a marketing strategist with Swift Communications, which has publications in Colorado, Utah, and California. We're hosting this live stream for about the next 45 minutes, and we're pleased to be joined today by Colorado Senator Michael Bennet. We've been collecting some questions from our readers for the Senator, and we also invite you to submit your questions on this feed, and we'll get to as many of those as we can for the last part of our session. I'd like to quickly introduce our editors in each of the communities we serve. In Colorado, we have Nate Peterson at the Vail Daily, Nicole Miller at the Summit Daily News, Peter Bauman at the Glenwood Springs Post-Independent, Lisa Schlichtman at the Steamboat Pilot and Today, David Krause at the Aspen Times, Kyle Mills at the Rifle Citizen Telegram, Eli Pace at the Sky High News in Grand County, Josh Carney at the Craig Press. Over in Utah, we have Bubba Brown at the Park Record in Park City. And in California, we have Bill Rozak at the Tahoe Tribune and Brian Hamilton with the Sierra Sun and Grass Valley Union. And working out on the plains with our ag pubs, we have Carrie Statham and Mariah Tibbetts at the Tri-State Livestock News and Ronna Johnson at the Fence Post. So our viewers know, after the stream, we will post a recording to all of our websites and social media, along with the others in our series, which we started back in March. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to David Krause, who's the editor of the Aspen Times and the lead of our editor group for Swift Communications.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Senator, for joining us. Just a quick bit of background on Senator Bennet for some of you who might not know all of his background. He was first appointed to the Senate in January of 2009 when then Senator Salazar was appointed to the head of the Interior Department by President Obama. Senator Bennet was elected then to the Senate in 2010 and reelected in 2016. The senator is a graduate of Yale Law School, was also the chief of staff for then Mayor John Hickenlooper and was named the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools before going to the Senate. And I've remembered this, Senator Bennet, and I don't know how I forgot this. You were born in India, correct?
That's true.
What's a little bit of background on that?
In New Delhi, India. I was born there in 1964 because my dad was working for our embassy there, and my mom was with him, and so I was born there. It's not the greatest political origin story in the world, although when I'm in India, which I occasionally am, people are extremely happy to meet the only United States senator in history to be born in New Delhi.
Yeah, that's a great trivia question, right?
I actually got in the mail a framed certificate from Holy Family Hospital, and with a photo of the doctor, who's a woman doctor who delivered me. She's still alive. She's in her 90s, just the other day. So it was nice.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, let's jump right into it. I know you're a busy man, and kind of let's talk about that. You've been working on a lot of bills lately, funding for state and local governments, renters relief, funding for rural hospitals, which we'll talk about later, small businesses, internet connections for kids. Senator, how do you prioritize your focus on bills? And to that point, which proposals do you see being addressed sooner than later in the Senate?
Well, thanks. And first of all, thanks for having me, and everybody who's listening. I'm grateful that you take time out of your day. I hope everybody's keeping themselves well and taking care of their friends and families and making sure we're looking after each other, which we need to do. You know, first of all, whenever you're dealing with something this big and this catastrophic, you know, which is the biggest and most catastrophic economic downturn we've had a health crisis that's become an economic crisis. During the downturn in 2009, you know, it was an economic crisis that was doing huge damage, but nothing close to what we're seeing today. I've approached the work the same way, which is when you know you're implementing legislation and bills from Washington, when they're this size, things are going to be broken. They're going to have to be fixed. And the only way to figure it out and to establish a set of priorities, as you were describing, is by having conversation after conversation after conversation, in my case, with Coloradans, all walks of life, in different arrangements. So sometimes it's a statewide town hall, sometimes it's a regional town hall, and I just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. And what I've discovered, first of all, is that the revenue law shortfall to our state and our counties is seismic. You know, I mean, it's probably 25% at least for the state, maybe 30% to 70%. Some of our counties, Aspen, as you know, has a $23 million revenue shortfall in their budget. And we've passed $3 trillion of stimulus, but of that, only $150 billion is for state and local governments. We have to do much more there. We got the PPP program out, the Paycheck Protection Program, but for a lot of Colorado businesses, especially resort businesses, restaurants, things like that, it hasn't worked out very well because they don't need the money yet. They need the money later. So the idea that somehow they're going to hire back all their employees right now while they're under the state orders to stay closed really struck them as something that didn't make a lot of sense. So there's one where Todd Young, is a Republican from Indiana, and I are working on a fix that I think has a very plausible chance of getting past the Senate. A version of it was in the House bill that was just passed. So I'm optimistic about that. And then the last thing I guess I'll mention too, one other thing is the need for us to have a healthcare infrastructure in this country, especially in rural areas. Colorado, the estimates of our public health folks is that they were only 40% funded before the pandemic happened. And if we are going to not just reopen the economy, but actually manage the pandemic and keep our economy open, which is what we need to do, we need an infrastructure in place to do the testing and to do the contact tracing and to ultimately do vaccines. And I think that we should have a health force that we fund to do that. They could hire hundreds of thousands of people across this country, give them 90 to 100 hours of training and put them in a decent paying job at a moment of record unemployment to create the infrastructure that we're going to need to stay, not just to open, but to stay open across the country. So those are some of the priorities that I'm working on right now.
Are you sleeping much?
I'm not sleeping that much, but I can't complain because my two oldest children have been forced home from college, which for them is an abject misery, but for me means that every single night we get to have dinner together. So at least there's been that.
Yeah.
Silver lining.
How do you see the level of bipartisanship in Washington right now, Senator? Is it decreasing during the crisis? Is it increasing? We're all talking about all of us being in together, but how do you feel that's been going on Capitol Hill?
I think it ebbs and flows, and for the last 10 years, it's ebbed, I'm sorry to say, but we did pass the first two large COVID bills with unanimous votes, and I don't think it was just that the Senate didn't want to come back, although that made it possible to have a unanimous vote. I think that people understood the urgency of what we were trying to deal with, and in broad strokes, could agree on what the priorities ought to be. Support for our hospitals, support for our frontline healthcare workers, some nominal amount of money for state and counties, but nowhere near what we need. Support for small business, unemployment insurance. That's a big untold story in all of this. We've dramatically expanded unemployment insurance. I think that's helpful. So all of that was bipartisan. Now you're beginning to see a season of a reversion to partisanship. The House is passing today a bill that I don't know whether it will have many Republican votes or not. Mitch McConnell has said it's dead on arrival in the Senate. And he's also said, well, maybe we don't need to pass anything more. I think those of us that are listening to the bipartisan voices of our governors and our county commissioners across our states are hearing that there is the need to do more. I'm not surprised Mitch McConnell's taking the negotiating position that he's taking, but my hope is that we'll be able to overcome his objection. Ironically, we have a guy in the White House, President Trump, who since the beginning has not cared at all about deficit spending. It's not been an interest of his or a worry or a concern of his. And in a pandemic or in an economic downturn like it, it's exactly the moment that we should be spending. But that creates maybe an opportunity to strike a deal among Pelosi, Schumer, and Trump that may not be what McConnell would have wanted, but something he'll put up with. We'll see what happens.
So speaking of that, Senator, you've been working on especially the rural hospital stuff with a couple of Republican senators from Alaska. And can you talk about the Rural Community Hospital Demonstration Program? I know your staff let us know there's 5 rural hospitals that you're focused on, or that this will really help in Colorado, including 3 of them in our communities in Frisco and in Glenwood Springs and in Craig. But why is this so important for our mountain communities and what that looks like?
Yeah, first of all, the St. Anthony's in Frisco Yampa Valley Medical Center at Steamboat, which is obviously away from you, Valley View Hospital and Glenwood and Delta County Memorial and Montrose, both. In fact, I just got a phone with the mayor of Montrose. Look, we're having a debate in the country, whether we know it or not, about whether rural America is going to continue to exist. I think we face enormous challenges and the answer to that question obviously has to be yes, but it's very hard for rural economies to do what they need to do if there is no hospital. And it's very hard for them to do what they need to do, by the way, if there are no schools. So both of these things have been a real focus for me. A hospital is a bedrock of any rural community in our state, and particularly in the Western United States, where the distances are so big. Just as a practical matter, you got to be relatively close to a place. And even before we were faced with this crisis, rural hospitals, and especially critical access hospitals and slightly larger hospitals, were facing unbelievable funding challenges, which were increasing the cancellation of elective surgeries and lack of access to masks and gloves and testing. The COVID only made that much, much worse. So at Aspen Valley Hospital, where I've been in touch with, a critical access hospital, at one point estimated a 90% loss in revenue due to closures and lack of elective procedures. Now they have access finally to federal funding, including the CARES Act money and the PPP money, but they're weighing potential structural changes, which we're hearing about everywhere. Actually, last year, interestingly, we had the largest number of rural hospital closures in the history of the country, and this year we're on track to being another record. So we've been working to get that PPP loan for the Aspen Hospital, which I think they got this week. There's more for us to do. So I've been working with Senator Barrasso, who's a Republican from Wyoming, our neighbor to the north, to provide an immediate influx of funding for more relief and stabilization to rural hospitals. It includes an increase in Medicare reimbursement in the swing bed program to help rural and urban hospitals better coordinate as people shift back and forth. It also includes a grant of providers equal to 3 months of payroll. Plus, I'm trying to get HHS to extend the term where hospitals have to pay their loans back. Barrasso is trying to help with that as well. You mentioned also the bill with Dan Sullivan and Lisa Murkowski, who are both from Alaska. They've got a bill to extend the Rural Community Hospital Demonstration Program for an additional 5 years, a program that currently provides increased reimbursement to 5 of our hospitals, as I mentioned, in Colorado. So the first 3 are in your region. So, if we can get some bipartisan work done in the Senate, I expect that these rural bills are going to be part of the next COVID package.
Are you surprised at how little the cash in hand, how many days cash in hand some of these rural hospitals are dropping down to now?
I'm actually really not surprised, because they're under such pressure. Even when everything is going well, they are just under extraordinary pressure. And they're different pressures. I mean, Aspen's got a sort of different situation because of the skiing part of it, but all of them are having difficult times. And when we had to essentially close, because what we said was no elective surgeries, which, as elective surgeries represent the vast lion's share of their revenue, it created a catastrophic cash flow problem, as you pointed out. So I think what we got to do is try to freeze everything in place until we get the other side of this thing, and people can start operating their business models again.
Let's talk about your proposal and some of the fixes that you think we should be making in the PPP and also the Restart program. What are you guys looking at? Extending it to a 16-week pay time, or what are some of the things that'll really help some of these?
That's a major piece of this. So the idea with PPP originally was, let's get the money to businesses and let's have businesses pay their employees so we can keep businesses and employees together. That's a good idea. The other thing was, since we have 50 different unemployment systems in the country and a lot of them are running software that's 50 years old, we knew that unemployment was going to take a while to kick in. And so I think the thought was, let's try to keep employees with their business. Well, the reality for restaurants all over the state of Colorado, hotels all over Aspen, you can't open, and you're not going to open within the 8 weeks. And it's a fool's errand to try to get people to rehire folks who are sheltering in place. And when your business is closed as a result of the state regulations. So what we do in our bill is we extend the coverage period for PPP from 8 weeks to 16 weeks for the hardest hit businesses. That's another problem here, is some of the people that got this stuff, businesses that got the resources early on because of design flaws, aren't the hardest hit folks. And so what we're saying is these should be companies where there's been a revenue decline by at least 25%. A lot of our businesses, restaurants, gyms, motels, and hotels have seen revenue collapses of 100%. So we're trying to target it better, and we're trying to extend it longer and allow them to have more flexibility for how they use the money, so that it's not just about what you're spending on payroll. Then the Restart program, which is the other piece of this also came directly from folks like our restaurant industry. This would help small and medium-sized businesses weather the next 6 months and provide much more flexible loans so people can get their businesses going again, with, again, a longer repayment period to help fill in the loss in revenues. The loans have really favorable terms. It's a 7-year loan, no interest due for the first couple of years, and reasonable rates thereafter, with 100% federal guarantee for all businesses that can attest to a significant 25% loss in revenue. And the forgiveness, as I say, is really based on the revenue loss. So, it doesn't surprise me. I don't condemn the people at all that wrote the first versions of this, but we need to improve it based on the real world experience of people in Colorado and across the country. And that's what Senator Young and I are trying to do.
And would that, Senator, change, would that grandfather in the people who started getting at the beginning, so they don't have the 8 weeks, now they do have 16, or how does that play?
It would grandfather people in, but it also would account for the fact that you got the money earlier if you did. So there's not going to be the ability for folks to double dip. And I don't think people want to do that anyway. I just think people understand we're trying to get it to the hardest hit businesses in a rational way, or as rational way as government can.
Yeah, that's a hard word to use in this time right now, right? Rational.
We need more of it, that's for sure.
Let's talk about education real quick, and then we'll open it up. We're getting a lot of good viewer questions.
Great.
So education, you spent 4 years as superintendent at DPS in Denver, and you proposed legislation to make sure students all have access to the internet through the E-rate program. How do you see the pandemic changing education in the next year, but also even in the next few years, even with a vaccine?
Yeah, I think we're going to be seeing real changes, and it's not going to be an optimal conclusion to put 30 little human beings in the same classroom with one teacher at the front of the room, or have passing periods, like the ones we do. Some urban areas or rural areas may be able to do that, some, but there are real building constraints in a lot of these places. So I think that's going to be a short-term issue. A longer-term issue, and something I hope we can be optimistic about, is the use of technology, in K-12 education, not as a replacement for what we have, but as something to enhance it, and for higher education as well, where we're seeing this disruption cause people maybe some more imagination about how we deliver these things. But I'll tell you something. I read these articles, about how this pandemic has revealed the deep inequities that exist in our country. I think anybody who spent any time in a poor kid's classroom over the last 30 years, and I've certainly seen my share of them, didn't need a pandemic to show what this inequity looked like. Anybody who understood anything about our lack of universal health care and the result of that with respect to people's access to primary care, which is now resulting in, the poorest communities being affected most negatively by COVID. There's a lot for us on education and healthcare to do. On education, I think one of the things that's become really clear is that if you don't have access to broadband internet in your school and in your house, it's like saying, it's tantamount to telling a kid they're not going to have textbooks. And today, nationally, 12 million kids don't have access to internet at home, obviously disproportionately from lower income, minority and rural areas. In Colorado, 54,000 school-age kids don't have access to the internet. 2 out of 3 of these kids are Latino. Almost 60% have a parent working in an essential industry. I've had conversations with teachers all over Colorado who are disconsolate because 50% of their kids really don't have access to the internet, and therefore they're having, the opportunity gap is widening. So that's one point. We got to fix that, and that's why I put the E-rate program in there, which would provide $4 billion for schools and libraries to buy mobile hotspots and Wi-Fi enabled devices. But I'll stop here. But you get me started on education, I can't stop. We have a huge problem in Colorado because we aren't funding our K-12 education system adequately. We're not funding our higher ed system adequately. And there is no place in America where kids in rural communities go to school 4 days a week other than in the state of Colorado. We now have kids going to school 4 days a week in Pueblo and in Brighton, neither of which are urban communities. And I think it's deeply unfair. I mean, Douglas County, Colorado would never allow its school district to go to 4 days. I realize, I understand there are arguments in the rural areas for it that are different than in the urban. So maybe I'll just say, when you see Pueblo and Brighton going to 4 days, that's an incredibly profound injustice. And when you look at the fact that we're paying our teachers in rural Colorado $33,000 to start, when Wyoming is paying $44,000 to start, we have a real problem on our hands, and we're going to have to find a way to address it if we hope to be able to preserve the rural economies that we all want to preserve.
Yeah, I think that's been a really interesting conversation. Everybody kind of shut down classes, and for different communities, it took different lengths of time based on, for our rural communities in parts of Colorado and Utah, based on, to your point, internet access, right? Let alone a child having a laptop or not, but just being able to get on internet access. And then you've got other areas where they're going through 5G and this whole movement, and trying to get that. I think people didn't realize how long that would slow down a school district to restarting school in the spring. So do you see that as somewhat solved, I guess, for now?
No, I don't think so. I think if you talk to teachers and superintendents, they're really worried. They feel like this has been a stopgap, and they've done as well as they could, and I think they probably have done as well as they could. But they are really worried, if we're not well prepared for the fall, that you're going to end up with an even greater achievement gap and opportunity. We already have that, by the way, as a country. I mean, we are today, because of the way our education system works or doesn't work, our system's actually reinforcing the income inequality we have rather than liberating people from their economic circumstances. And that is a profound headwind to the soundness of our economy and the soundness of our democracy. Doesn't have to be that way. We can turn that around, but there has been inadequate attention to that, and especially in our urban and rural school districts.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, speaking of our rural communities, Kelly, let's open it up to the viewer questions that you've been pulling in for the senator for about the next 15 minutes, if we can.
Sure, sounds good. We've gotten a couple questions around this, Senator Bennet, and I'll just go with this one from Erica in the chat. Erica is a trustee in the town of Carbondale. What is being done by Congress to get federally coordinated testing and contact tracing in place, and especially to support our small municipal governments?
Right. So again, this is vital, because I was on the phone this morning with a bunch of religious leaders from all over America, and there was a minister from South Korea, of all places, on there as well. I don't know why he was there, but he was there. South Korea is open. South Korea's businesses are open. Their hotels are open. Their schools are open. And the fundamental reason why they are is they've had the infrastructure in place that the questioner from Carbondale is asking about. And we need the national government to do this. We are one nation under God for a reason, and it's for exactly this kind of a moment. If you've been paying any attention to what's been going on in our hospitals, for example, because we have no national plan, they've had to compete with each other to get personal protective equipment for their employees, PPE, it's called, masks and gowns and all that stuff. That competition, which even our VA hospitals have been part of, because there's no plan for the VA, all that's done is create enormous scarcity and enormous expense. If we had had a national approach, we could have been strategic, kept the cost down, gotten it out to everybody. It's exactly the same with testing and with and the way I'm trying to address, and with contact tracing, because we can open up and test all the people that we want, but if you don't do the contact tracing, if you don't do the follow-up, the public health people tell you we're just going to be back in this. So my health force idea with Kirsten Gillibrand from New York would create slots for hundreds of thousands of Americans to be trained. As I said earlier, the money would all go to local communities. It's based on the decentralized setup that we have in the state of Colorado for public health. So the decisions about how to spend it would be made at the local level. But man, people in Colorado are saying to me, we do not have the resources even to deal with the public health that we were dealing with before the pandemic. So lost in it, my answer is, this is why I'm so deeply disappointed by President Trump's approach on testing and on PPE, because I think it's been very self-defeating. You know, he can put signs up all day long at the White House saying we've got the best testing in the world. That doesn't make it true. And there isn't anybody really except the president working with Congress that can achieve this. I hope things are going to get better in the days ahead. Hope springs eternal.
Nothing wrong with that. All right, kind of going along that, this one's from our state rep, Dylan Roberts, who represents Eagle and Routt counties. Large cities and counties got funding for their municipal budget shortfalls in the CARES Act, but small counties and towns were excluded. What's being done to ensure that some of our small counties and towns can get some relief? So
we should have never had that 500,000 threshold to begin with. It was a failure in the legislation, and it's been a problem from the very start. Senator Gardner and I actually sent a letter together to the Treasury Secretary, and it's saying that you should interpret this as liberally as possible, small L liberally, to create as much flexibility for small communities as possible. The future bills, none of them have that limitation, and so what we've got to do is get the state and local revenue replacement as part of these bills. And I'm telling everybody, don't expect, there's not going to be good days. You know, our choices are going to be between terrible budgets and really terrible budgets. If we don't act on another COVID bill at state and local, we're not going to do it. And as long as Dylan Roberts is on the phone, I want to thank him very much for everything that he has done to try to create a public option for health insurance in the state of Colorado. This is an illustration, couldn't be a better illustration of why we need universal health care. And I think that's the way we're going to get it fastest and is most likely to ultimately pass. So thanks, Dylan, for your leadership.
We got a couple questions around this same topic. Unemployment assistance is important. However, a national figure said 40% of people are making more money with the additional funding of $600 a week on employment than they did at their job. now that businesses are starting to open back up, there's no incentive for employees to come back to work. So how can that be handled? What can be done to address
we
that?
definitely can handle it. We definitely have to. I think the 40% number is higher than reality, but that doesn't matter. You don't want a single person to be disincentivized from going back to work as long as they're not sick and as long as there's a job waiting for them. So I think we have to do two things here. Right now, the way this unemployment is set up is that, first of all, you've got that disincentive issue, which we need to deal with. And second, it ends on a date certain. Instead of doing two rational things, which would be extending the availability of unemployment insurance until the economy starts to improve. There's no reason to cut it off prematurely. If we've got 33 million people that are unemployed today, and a month from now we have 23 million unemployed, we're still going to need it. And it doesn't make sense to me for us to have that cutoff. But at the same time we do that, we have got to ratchet it down so the amount is not creating that disincentive. And the bill that I have with Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island would do both of those things. And that's a perfect example of feedback that I've gotten from calls like this across Colorado that's changed the work that we're trying to do.
Sure, got it. Shifting gears a little bit back to education here. This one's from Judy. I would like to ask about what, if anything, is planned to help our young adults, college-age kids especially. We're not included in the stimulus, but are over age 17, have lost their summer jobs and recently graduated college and face a very uncertain job market.
So my initial proposal on this, because it partly, I'm trying to figure out where to start. My initial proposal on these direct payments was to give everybody in America $2,000. Ultimately, it was $1,200, including people in the population that you described, and they've been excluded. And I think fundamental fairness would suggest that they should have been included. Obviously, with income thresholds, we don't want people getting the money that don't need it, but that's the way the systems are designed to begin with. Now that the unemployment's in place, hopefully that can be a help. I think that we are going to have to think about ways of engaging a whole generation of young people that are graduating from college in national service, in the pandemic itself. These would be natural folks to sign up for the health force that I've proposed, for the national service stuff that Chris Kuntz from Delaware has proposed. And I would say overall, we have to start investing again in our human capital, and that means our young people. We really haven't done that since Ronald Reagan was president. We've cut our investment in the next generation of Americans by almost 40% over that period of time. And I think on the back end of this pandemic, we got to start investing in our people again and our physical infrastructure as well.
Sure, makes sense. We got several questions kind of around this. I'll go with this one from Karen that just came through. What's the best way to regulate tourism in the mountain communities, and also reopen hospitality is really important for a lot of the places where we are?
The overarching thing is making sure that we've got the healthcare infrastructure in place that I mentioned earlier so that we can deal with the testing and the other stuff. We have to decide whether we're going to continue to be managed by the virus or whether we're going to manage the virus. And I think we can manage this virus if we have the infrastructure in place. I won't repeat the stuff that I said earlier, but I think that's particularly important for resort communities. When you see festivals being canceled, if you live in a place like Silverton, which is, where you've got to make your 12-month nut in 4 months, it becomes really important that you're not closed during that 4 months and that you know that you're open. But I've heard people in resort communities say, we're worried about opening up the public lands. We're worried about, people from the city coming with COVID. And again, the way we're going to get through that is by having the testing and contact tracing. And I would finally say we're going to have an incredibly dynamic feedback loop between the governor's office and recreational communities who are learning from each other and saying, we figured out a way to open restaurants this way, and we figured out a way to operate ski lifts that way. And those are the kinds of things that no edict from the government at the outset is going to anticipate. We're going to have to hear from all of you as you start to open up what's working and what's not working. And we've got to be honest about all of that, I think, because the worst thing that happens is we end up with another spike threatening our healthcare system, and then the economy will be shut again.
Sure. Kind of going back to a follow-up question on the PPP, discussion today mentioned the PPP loan may change the percentage of forgiveness from 75-25 to 100% for payroll and qualified expenses. Is that something that's on the table?
That is something that's on the table.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about—
to be more precise about it, I think what's on the table is making sure that the ratio isn't so confined. So it doesn't just have to be spent on payroll. It could be spent on other operating costs of the business. So I don't think we're talking about changing the ratio overall. I think what we're talking about is making it more flexible and therefore more generous that way.
Right, makes sense. I think this is a big question as people start to return to work. Maybe your take on this. What changes might we envision for preschools, daycare centers, places like that? How can we support parents as they're returning to work and making sure they have childcare?
Well, first of all, I think we should, I hope many of us at least are comprehending how important universal pre-K would be to our society in the wake of this pandemic. I mean, one of the very first things that we had to do was figure out how to give people the opportunity to pay for preschool who are the folks on the front lines of the healthcare battle. Well, the people every day who are having to make decisions about what to do with kids, or whether to leave them at home or not work because we don't have a system of preschool in the country, and of course many other industrialized countries in the world do. So I'd say that's a broad policy direction that we should be heading. In the meantime, we have a massive problem because we are paying people in our facilities less money than people make at places like Dairy Queen. Literally, I'm not making it up. And it's hard to keep somebody, teaching our youngest kids when that's the economic circumstances they find themselves in. At the same time, and this is a great irony of our early childhood system, at the same time, the places cost too much for people to afford it comfortably. So I remember when I was running for re-election in 2016, I was in Rifle, Colorado, and I was at an early childhood center there. They were really happy to have it because they had to drive to Glenwood before, so it was there. But one of the moms said, I work so I can have insurance, health insurance, and every single dollar that I make goes to this early childhood center so I can work. And that's the triangle that so many Coloradans are captured in. And we've got to figure out how to at the same time pay people in these centers and reduce the costs. And that is going to be a real challenge. We're going to have to do this in partnership with every level of government because nobody's going to be able to figure out how to do it on their own.
Sure, absolutely. We've got a couple more questions here. Thank you. This is great info. I think we're getting a lot of our questions answered from our communities, so we appreciate it. This one's from Rick, and I think that this is something that people are wondering about with seeing these huge stimulus bills rolling out. How do we envision that the CARES Act will actually be paid for and maybe the next round of stimulus bills?
I'm so happy that you asked this question, Rick. And I'm happy because the last 10 years of my life in Washington, and I'm not saying this, you can look it up. Here's my book. It's called The Land of Flickering Lights. There's a whole chapter in here about these fiscal fights. And the reality of the last 10 years is the Democrats in Washington haven't cared about the fiscal stuff, and the Republicans say they care, but they're lying about it. The reality is it's easier for everybody to tell everyone their taxes are too high and that we're spending too much money, and then spend the money and keep cutting the taxes. Since 2001, we have borrowed $5 trillion from the Chinese to give tax cuts to the richest people in America. That would be like any community. I was going to say Aspen. I'm not going to say Aspen for other reasons. Let's say the mayor of Basalt decided, I'm gonna take out more debt than basalt. Let's pick rifle. That's even better. We take out more debt than has ever been taken out before in rifle. I said, really? What are you going to spend the money on? Are you spending on infrastructure? No. Are you spending on roads and bridges? No. Are you spending on water? No. Schools? No. Mental health? No. Fire? Parks? No. What are you going to do with the money? I'm going to take it and I'm going to give it to the richest neighborhood in town. That's what we have done since 2001. And when you combine that with the $5.6 trillion that we spent on 2 wars that lasted for 20 years in the Middle East that did not achieve the objectives that we said we would set out to achieve, borrowed every single cent of that from the Chinese, and we've got a completely unsustainable healthcare system that's spending more than twice as much as any other industrialized country in the world. You add all that up and you say to yourself, how well prepared were we for this pandemic? And the answer is not at all. And as recently as his first year in office, Donald Trump cut taxes for the wealthiest people in America and drove up the deficit for the first time since Vietnam. We have had a deficit going up while the unemployment rate was going down. So the way this is supposed to work is at a moment when you've got an economic collapse, that's when you spend. And when you're growing, that's when you need to husband your resources. We have done none of that well as a country for the last 40 years, and I hope on the back end of this, we will be able to do it. We will be able to walk and chew gum at the same time in a way that allows us to make the investments that our people need us to make in them and in their infrastructure, and at the same time, over time, balance our fiscal imbalance.
All right, we want to wrap it up because we know you got another business roundtable that you have to move over to, but we have one lighthearted question to wrap it up on, which is tell us about the ship behind you in your office.
That ship is made out of chicken bone, and it was made by prisoners of war many years ago, and it came from my grandparents who gave it to me many years ago. So.
Thanks. All right. With that, we're going to wrap it up today. Thank you for being here so much and answering the questions and taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I want to say, as the brother of a journalist, how much I appreciate the work of all of our journalists. You guys are facing, huge challenges, just like everybody else, or maybe even tougher than other people trying to reimagine your business model. And I imagine this is all going to make that even more significant as we go ahead. And I'll just sign off by saying I look forward to seeing all of you soon in person soon again. So thanks. And David, thank you. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again too, Senator. I appreciate you taking
Senator.
the time.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator.
Bye.
So long.
Just a reminder, we'll have this available for replay on all of our local websites, along with our other live streams, and stay tuned for information about our next live stream. See you next time. I'm Kelly Geary-Agnew with Swift Communications, along with David Krause from the Aspen Times, signing off.
Thank you.